Okay, well, thank you very much for your patience. It's a great honor to be back in Michigan. I'm really honored by the chance to be part of the Medical Ethics Resource Network, or MERN, of Michigan meeting, as well as this really splendid event that we've just heard described, how much all of us are going to learn as a result of this conference. And a chance to see old friends here is an added pleasure. The presentation this morning is a joint project. My colleague Arlene McDonald, and would Arlene please be recognized? And this is the person who helped me greatly. She's our new addition to our group in Galveston this past year, coming to us from University of Toronto in religious studies and anthropology of religion. And we've divided up the material, and the way you'll know even though I'm going to present here, is that if it makes sense, that probably means that that's Arlene's contribution to the talk. So first I'm going to say a few things about bioethics, because there may be some people who have not closely attended to the development over the past 4 decades of this field in the United States. So this will be a very superficial and very, very quick attempt to get us sort of all at the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about bioethics. So a lot of people think that at least before the 1960s, we had what you might call the old medical ethics. And this was often relied on oaths and codes, such as the Hippocratic Oath or the Code of Ethics of the American Medical Association. It was assumed at that time that only practitioners of medicine were competent to address ethical issues in medicine. So imams, philosophers, social scientists, lawyers were not welcome. They obviously didn't know anything about medical practice, so go away and leave it to the doctors to talk about ethics, if they ever did. It was assumed at much of this time that a paternalistic attitude toward the patient was the right way to do medicine. So phrases like "doctor knows best" or "following doctor's orders" captured that sense of medical paternalism. And there were no formal courses in medical ethics in the vast majority of medical schools. It was assumed that you learned this by example. You watched your senior professors, who of course were complete paragons of virtue, and that would be what ethics was. So we got tired of this around the 1960s as part of the general sort of anti-authoritarian social upheaval of that time, some people think. And so the first wave of the new bioethics rode on the back of interest in ethical principles. I'm sorry, went too far here. So basically, the feeling of that time is that the complex problems of the new medicine, organ transplants, intensive care units, resuscitation, etc., required input from scholars in multiple fields, including ethics, law, and policy. Now, it's important to remember that the first wave of these scholars coming into bioethics actually came from religion. But they were soon supplanted and pushed out of the way by philosophers who pretty much then took over the show and sort of marginalized for some time input from the religious traditions. And the sort of big discovery of the day that everybody got excited about was the discovery of the primacy of patient autonomy, the idea that patients have rights and values that need to be respected. And so we ended up with ideas like informed consent and ideas like the right to refuse treatment, even in the case of life-prolonging therapy. Now, since the 1970s and 1980s, there's been some further development of the field. So the focus in the early days on principles like the principle of respect for patient autonomy, which are thought to be abstract, general, and universal concepts, has been criticized increasingly as one and not the sole approach to the field of bioethics. As part of this criticism of what some call principlism, there's been a turn in bioethics, I would argue, toward the greater appreciation for the particular and the local in ethical thinking. And this has led to the door opening better for less reliance on philosophical ethics and more attention to the social sciences, movements such as feminism and narrative approaches and cultural studies. And once again, I think religion is seen as being more welcome as a contributor to the dialogue when we're not so fixated on what's general and what's universal as we are on the local and the particular. So with this extremely superficial account, let me now turn to the initial question, which I think is posed by this conference. What can Islamic religion, history, and culture teach today's bioethics, particularly as we heard in the US context? And this is not the question that I will address. I'm going to talk as a way of setting the stage for that real question of the conference. I'm going to try to set the stage by talking about the more general question of how should bioethics think about religion. And basically what we're going to present this morning is very much a view from 35,000 feet. And later in the conference we'll be, as you hear, going down to ground level. And we'll descend to lower altitudes twice during this talk. But generally this is what you're going to get, is the view from above, and hopefully this will help in terms of our later discussion of the real world. So basically what we set out to do is we argue that some misconceptions get in the way of bioethics thinking about religion in the most helpful way. And these misconceptions basically fall under two categories. Some have to do with what we think religion is, and some have to do with how we see the role of religion in a diverse democratic society. So those are the two big divisions of what I'm going to be presenting here. So first of all, let's talk about what is religion. Well, the view that we're going to be critical of is what we think is a set of common views about religion. Religion is a body of relatively static, fixed theological teachings, that religion is a tradition that shapes the beliefs and actions of its adherents, that religion is separate and distinct from the secular realm, and this funny phrase that I'll talk about a little bit, modernity's irrational remainder. Basically what this phrase means is that in pre-modern times, human beings were mentally very primitive. We believed in magic and superstition. Then modern times came along and we got science and we got rationality. But it didn't completely take over, and what's left from the old days of magic and superstition, that's what we call religion. Okay? So you've already heard in the lovely introduction we've had the criticism of several of these views. So what we're going to do is try to develop a little more deeply an alternative way of thinking about religion that we hope will be better than these common, but we believe misconceived ways of thinking. So now let's say, does this have anything to do with real life, or is this purely a theoretical debate? So descending quickly from 35,000 feet to a lower altitude, let's look at a particular example of how bioethics might go wrong, where the way it goes wrong, I think, is traceable to those four ways of thinking about religion. So transplant advocates discover that organ donations are rare among the members of a particular religious community. So the advocates immediately go to the book. They go to the theology, they read the theology, and they discover that there are no prohibitions of organ donation in the holy book, whatever that is for that particular religious group. They then go to the community and say, we've got news for you guys. There is no, the organ donation is permissible according to your religion, so get in line and give your organs, please. Sign up. They don't. There's no change. The bioethicists, the advocates, then assume, boy, are those people primitive, superstitious, and backward. There's no way to reason with those people. And so they turn their backs and go off to do good somewhere else. So we would argue that what's going on here is shaped by, this comes from some of Arlene's work on organ transplantation in Canada. And this is an example, I think, where the wrong conceptions of religion shape problems that crop up in the real world when people think they're doing a good thing, and maybe if they'd taken a little different perspective, there could have been a better communication and maybe some better results. So here's what we're going to propose. Instead of thinking about religion, and this is a view that is basically grounded in sociology and anthropology of religion, which we're going to argue that for bioethics purposes in no way ought to replace theological studies, but definitely should supplement theological studies. So instead of thinking of religion solely as a body of theological teaching, we want to talk about what does it mean to think instead about lived religious experience. Instead of assuming that tradition is what shapes beliefs, we'll want to suggest that maybe it's helpful to think about this lived religious experience being shaped by multiple cultural inputs. Instead of imagining a sharp distinction between the secular and the religious, we want to suggest that maybe these are constructed categories and contested categories, that they talk back and forth all the time, argue back and forth all the time, and an awful lot of interesting stuff happens at the boundary. Finally, instead of this really sort of insulting idea of modernity's irrational remainder, we'd like to talk about continuously evolving religiosity that participates in and is part of either modernity or postmodernity, as you wish. So let's talk about those four ideas that we think are improved ways for bioethics to engage in thinking about religion. The idea of lived religious experience admits and acknowledges, as I hope I've made clear, that theological study is important and valuable and cannot be replaced. But it should be supplemented by careful attention to the lived experiences of ordinary individuals, some of which converge with and some of which may depart from certain elements of orthodox instruction. And the bottom line here that I think is very helpful to keep in mind, merely knowing one's religious denominational affiliation may be a poor guide as to what one believes and how one experiences religiosity in one's life. So getting us back to the people's experiences, the people's lived experiences, the people's beliefs on the ground is something that I think we need to be reminded of the importance of. Now, the next concept we want to suggest as a helpful way to think about religion and its contributions to bioethics is the idea of multiple cultural inputs. So the religious identities of both individuals and communities, according to this view, are constantly in conversation with lots of things, which we don't often think of under the heading of religion. But media, popular culture, even advertising is part of what religion and religiosity is constantly in conversation with. Law and policy, as we'll talk about here, literature, economics, global flows of information, globalization generally, political ideologies, and, not the least, medicine and science. Another descent from 35,000 feet. I believe it's possible today to hire people at a fairly sizable rate who will come into your hospital and they will teach you about cultural competency. And as part of their teaching about cultural competency, they will get up before the group and they will say, if your patient is a Sunni Muslim, here's what they think. Here's what they believe. And the question is that cultural competency? Now, according to the old view, maybe that would be cultural competency. According to the view we're advocating, it's a start. It gets you somewhere. But where do you want to end up? You don't want to stop there. Where you want to end up is, are our ears properly attuned to multiple kinds of moral discourse with a deepened respect for the range of human experience and choice? So I think what we're saying here is the same thing. Are you going to be told that in order to have cultural competency, you need to know the Islamic view? Or are you going to be told these are some Islamic views? What's going to be true cultural competency? Back up to the high altitude. Notice what's in red in this previous slide, and that suggests something very important about the next topic, okay? This idea of the religious versus the secular as a firm divide, or as a chasm. Again, we're suggesting that a better way for bioethics to think about these concepts is that both terms are contested and constantly in flux. Many beliefs and activities that seem to be one or the other turn out on deeper inquiry to be hybrids. In particular, viewing medicine as secular may blind us to implicit religious elements, particularly in US practice. So one of the things that Arlene studied in her work in Canada, how often are miracle metaphors used in medical discourse, particularly in the area of organ transplant? Why? What is going on? What kind of work is being done when you encounter comment about miracles in a hospital? Okay. So major important concepts that are very, very important to our understanding our lives and understanding bioethics, such as gender, race, socioeconomic status, and power differentials, shape how we define these terms, religious and secular, and in turn are shaped by the way we contest and navigate this boundary line, this porous boundary between religious and secular. Finally, what about this concept that religion is modernity's irrational remainder. It is the bit of magic and superstition that has somehow survived the onslaught of science and rationality. Well, again, what we think is a better view would say religiosity, particularly in North America, is continuously evolving. Religious responses to new medical technologies and so on is not a foregone conclusion. You can't just read it off the past record. You can't just say, let's go back to the tradition and this tells us what the future is going to be. Because of those multiple socio-cultural influences that we listed, religious experiences today are not formed in the same way as in the past. And the evolution of religion and religiosity and religious lived experience opens really interesting possibilities where bioethics can contribute and where bioethics can learn. New kinds of religious identities, new theological directions, new moral communities. So what I've done now is try to first answer the first half of the question we posed, which is, how do we think about religion in bioethics, and are we thinking about religion in the best way that would encourage the dialogue that we want to have between religion and bioethics? So what I'm now going to do is turn to the next question that we posed at the beginning, the next sub-question, which is how should we view the role of religion in a diverse democratic society, which I'm going to assume is what the U.S. is and in fact aspires to be. And what I'm going to present here is heavily influenced by and shaped by one particular philosopher, a fellow named John Rawls, who is considered by many to be the most prominent and influential socio-political philosopher in America during the 20th century, particularly his book, A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. I'm going to use Rawls as an exemplar of what is called the liberal political philosophy in America. And this is a small L liberal, not liberal in the political sense. This is liberal in the sense that the Declaration of Independence is liberal. If you believe in people having rights and government existing through the consent of the governed, you are a liberal in that small L liberal sense, okay? So the language could be puzzling to people, so let me underline that's what philosophers mean in socio-political philosophy when they use the term liberal. And John Rawls is thought by many as the leading liberal socio-political philosopher in America of the 20th century. There are some different ways you could talk about what I'm going to be saying in this section of the presentation. Another way to ask the question is, does toleration, religious toleration, is there a way it could actually turn into intolerance? And if toleration is good, do we have to stop there? Or is there something beyond toleration that we can aspire to in a society such as the US? Now, Rawls was concerned with a philosophical account of a just society. What is justice? And basically, the way he got started on this is his basic idea that all his work is in one way or another elaboration of, is he saw justice fundamentally as fairness. Justice was about fairness. So everything in his picture is grounded in this core idea. He wanted to focus, as I'll come back to several times, the bare minimum political framework for society. What is the sort of foundation? What is the sort of core structure that a society should assume in order to be fair, in order to have justice? What does it take to create the basic structure of society, recognizing there'll be lots and lots and lots of details that'll have to be added in later. But for a philosopher, he said, if I could just get this bare minimum structure, then I've done my job. He assumed, as liberals do, government derives authority from the consent of the governed, and that the government ought to respect, society ought to respect, a fair society ought to respect a wide array of basic rights, and the rights should be assigned to all people equally. So these are philosophical ideas. Rawls also accepted not a philosophical idea, but what he thought was a basic fact. Whether you like it or not, here it is. There's a wide diversity of religious and philosophical views and commitments among the people who live in a society like the one he was talking about, and he thought the United States was that kind of a society. Okay? So this is the jumping off point. Now, Rawls had to imagine for a thought experiment, which is another way that liberal philosophers think about this, imagine the kind of thought experiment you would create as if a bunch of people who never historically really existed were to get together to choose the basic structure of society. because that would make it okay that people freely consented to it. Then you would know that this structure of society had moral justification. If it's the kind of thing that free people would choose over some other alternative way of structuring society. Okay? So who are these folks who do the choosing? Well, he wanted to know what sort of individuals would ideally choose the principles that determine the minimum basic structure, again, where the idea is fairness. So he suggested these folks would first of all be rational people, or parties, not really people, but parties, the sort of algebraic equations, if you will. He thought that they ought to be mutually disinterested. That is, they didn't care about each other's welfare. They were not against other people. They didn't want to climb over somebody else's back, but they just didn't that much care about other people. They mostly cared about their own advantages, and they were concerned to advance their own, and they could be thought of as perhaps like heads of households. Their own and an intimate group of people close to them were people that what they cared about. Rational, mutually disinterested folks. And again, this is a thought experiment, said Rawls. I'm not saying this ever historically happened or should or will happen. It's a thought experiment for a philosopher. So as a result of this starting point, Rawls and fellow liberal philosophers, I would argue, ended up with a certain kind of conception that affects how religion shows up in their idea of the basic structure of society. Okay? And this conception, we could rely on the metaphor of the public square. The public square is where you go to do the public business in this just, fair society. And outside the public square, which is limited, is this very large private sphere. So what goes on in the public square? In the public square, we have government, obviously. We have institutions that serve large swaths of society on an equal basis, such as public schools and most hospitals. And it is here in the public square that we come as citizens to debate public policy. What are the taxes going to be? What are the ways we're going to appropriate, share or not share appropriations with higher education and K through 12, et cetera, et cetera? Are we going to have public employee unions or take away union rights? Those things, debates, those all occur in the public square. And then there's the private sphere. Family life, clubs, voluntary associations, and churches and religious beliefs, according to this theory at least, are part of the private sphere. Okay, so this basic picture, I think, is implicit in a lot of the arguments made by Rawls and his colleagues. So this leads us, I think, to what is a relatively traditional view of religion according to liberal theories of justice, which is basically what we're calling religious toleration. According to this view, religion and religious discourse, as we said, belong in the private sphere. Government cannot interfere with religious beliefs. Government therefore should treat all religions equally, privileging none. So again, remembering that there is no word in the Constitution that talks about the separation of church and state. That phrase, I don't believe, is in the Constitution. What is in the Constitution, I believe, is government shall not establish a religion. Okay? So government should be carefully even-handed among different religious views. It should not favor any, it shouldn't detract from any. Very even, just fair. All right? Religious arguments, as a result of this, are not welcome in the public square. They have to be tolerated because there's freedom of speech. If somebody wants to go into public square and read from the Bible, they can. We can't shut them up. It's not right because they have freedom of speech. But that person is not welcome according to this philosophical tradition. So we would appeal to civic virtue, not rights, but civic virtue, to tell that person, would you please go somewhere else to read the Bible, not the public square. The theory behind that exclusion is a couple of things. First of all, what we're trying to get in a public square is what government is ultimately grounded in and justified by, which is the consent of the governed. We're trying to reach some kind of democratic consensus in the public square. If each person can spout off their own personal religious views, which in this society are differ among people, that's going to be divisive. It's not going to be unifying, says this tradition. So that's one of the reasons this is not a good way to have discourse in the public square. The other reason it's not a good way to have discourse in the public square is it's hard to tell the difference sometimes between talking about religion and proselytizing others to join your religion. And if that's true, then this is something the state really can't engage in. The state can't be part of your trying to sign up new people for your religion. That's unfair. So this has to be ruled out according to this set of principles as a desirable. Again, they have a right to. We can't stop them because that would be interfering with freedom of speech. It's not desirable. It's not welcome according to this concept of civic virtue that arises from this liberal tradition. Okay? So the picture that Rawls had initially was something he later developed in a book called Political Liberalism. And in the book called Political Liberalism, he talked a lot about comprehensive doctrines. So in a society like ours, there's lots and lots of different comprehensive doctrines because there's different religions, different philosophical views. These comprehensive doctrines, according to Rawls, are worldviews, largely writ. They are each of our individual ways of thinking about our lives, our moral duties, the hereafter, our relationship to the universe, our relationship to other people, our relationship to the deity. Whatever is or isn't is part of that large view. That's our comprehensive doctrine. Our comprehensive doctrine tells us pretty much all about every aspect of our lives. Okay? They will, in a society like ours, differ in many respects. And Rawls says, because we have to reach consensus on the basic structure of society in order for this to be just and fair, we could not possibly ever come to agreement about this whole array of comprehensive doctrines. So how do we come to agreement in a diverse democratic society where we have such diversity among all these different comprehensive doctrines? Well, the only way that can happen, says Rawls, is for purposes of the basic structure of society. It is essential that the vast majority, not all, the vast majority of these comprehensive doctrines has to have a bare minimum of certain values in common. And these values can be very simple values like, very uncontroversial values like, if you know your neighbor disagrees with your comprehensive doctrine, and based on your neighbor's take, he would or she would vote for people who disagree with your comprehensive doctrine. And it's election day and your neighbor is on his way to the polls, you are not supposed to take out your gun and shoot your neighbor. Okay, so if you can agree on that, if you can agree on very, very basic principles of mutual respect, rights, the goals of a democratic society, pretty simple stuff, very limited, you've got enough agreement to make the basic structure get going. And once you get the basic structure going, you can add on extra details, you can add on a lot of stuff, but it's the basic structure that Rawls is interested in. And that's the level of consensus you need, says Rawls, to get consensus on this. So he calls this the overlapping consensus. And the overlapping consensus is all this stuff here is all the stuff that we disagree about, but if we just disagree about this core common area of basic democratic values, we can have a just, fair society in its basic structure. Now notice there's that comprehensive doctrine out here that doesn't participate in the overlapping consensus. For example, that could be a skinhead comprehensive doctrine that says certain people should be denied rights solely on the basis of race. You're just not going to have agreement with those folks, okay? Rawls thinks that if these are in the minority, a small minority of all the comprehensive doctrines, you could still get going. You don't need to get everybody to agree. You can get the vast majority of people to agree, and then you could go ahead saying this is a just and fair, justifiable basic structure for society. So this leads, I think, to this minimal view of toleration, religious toleration. Citizens should engage in public debate and discourse in the public square, ideally always using appeals to the overlapping consensus only, not to the parts of their comprehensive doctrines that differ, but always appealing to values and reasons that are translatable to that area of overlapping consensus. Each of us should basically check our comprehensive doctrines at the door when we go into the public square to have debate about public issues. Even if our comprehensive doctrine informs the views that we take on public matters, we should translate those views into terms that can be stated ideally solely in terms of that area of overlapping consensus. And you could make this an even stronger argument by saying that if we don't do that, we really indicate disrespect for others' divergent comprehensive doctrines. If I insist on invoking my comprehensive doctrine when I walk into the public square to have a debate about public policy, then I'm showing that I'm dissing your comprehensive doctrine. And that's not good if our goal is consensus around fair policies that respect everyone equally. Okay? So this is the kind of view of religious toleration that Rawls at least initially favored. Some people didn't like this. So advocates for some religious perspectives, some religious people had no problem with this. They said, that's fair. We are treated the same as any other religion, so this is okay. We're all right with this. But others didn't. Others said this is wrong. They said, you think, Rawls, that you're being religiously neutral. You think that you're not playing favorites. Well, you're wrong. Because basically what you're doing is your overlapping consensus actually creates a new comprehensive doctrine. It's then privileged as the official state doctrine, because civic virtue says it's the only one that's really welcome in the public square, and this doctrine is non-religious and secular. And we think, actually, Rawls and company, it's not just non-religious, we think it's anti-religious. So we don't like this new comprehensive doctrine, and yet you say in the name of fairness that you are going to impose this comprehensive doctrine on everybody in society, which is exactly contrary to the principles of fairness that you espouse. So this was a serious criticism of Rawls's minimalist scheme of religious toleration. So Rawls took that seriously, and in some of his later work, just before his death, he tried to respond. So here's what some of the things he said. He said, guys, remember, the public square is really a very small part of life. There's many, many places in the private sphere that you can have all kinds of deep, searching, probing discussions about all kinds of ways that your comprehensive doctrines shape and ought to shape public policy. You have your clubs, you have your associations, even conferences like this make it clear that it's okay, even in a public institution such as University of Michigan. Certainly at churches and religious gatherings, you can talk about this. So I'm imposing a very minimal restriction by this idea of toleration and civic virtue. So don't get your knickers in a knot, basically, said Rawls. But he then admitted something, which I think is very, very important admission. He pointed out that individual citizens, when debating in the public square, actually might refer to their comprehensive doctrines. And he said something extremely important. It has the advantages of citizens informing one another where they come from, so to speak. Now that's a huge, important statement. It basically points out the possibility that if my thoughts on public policy are shaped by my comprehensive doctrine, my Islamic faith, for example, and I go into the public square and I don't make that known, I'm lying. I'm concealing from the folks I'm supposed to be respecting a critically important piece of information that would give them content and context to why I'm making this argument. And Rawls acknowledged that there's a value in not lying like that, in being open, being transparent. So I think that was a very, very important statement that Rawls made. Having made that statement, he then wanted immediately to take it away. He wasn't comfortable. He was sticking his neck out too far, and so he immediately said after that, the duty of civility requires a return to public reason eventually to justify legislation or policy. So I can maybe dabble a little bit, and my comprehensive doctrine teaches me that this is the policy, but forget all that because now I'm giving you a whole lot of reasons that all have to do with the overlapping consensus. So Rawls kind of stuck his neck out a little bit, but he kind of then pulled it back, I'm afraid, in his final writings. Why is Rawls so concerned about this minimal structure? Why is he so afraid of sticking his neck out beyond this bare bones view of religious toleration? Well, there's method there. There's a reason for that, okay? His reason is that since we must reach consensus to assent to the basic principles for the structure of society, a philosophical argument will be strongest to the extent that it appeals to the fewest number of assumptions and the least controversial assumptions. So therefore, Rawls assumed that if you have mutually disinterested parties, each one seeking his or her own advantage, you're making the bare minimum very uncontroversial assumptions. And so philosophically, nobody can claim that you're sneaking your comprehensive doctrine in the back door, and that's what's shaping the basic structure of society. Okay? Now, did Rawls believe morally that we are only mutually disinterested people? Did he believe that none of us are motivated by compassion, by care, by altruism? He didn't believe that for a minute. He knew that the moral life was much, much richer and deeper than mutual disinterest and rationality. But he said that comes later. We'll add that back later on. First, we'll agree on the basic structure of society, and then my work here is done, and then we can add that other stuff in. Okay, so that's his method. That's what he's trying to accomplish. And that method leads to this bare bones, very limited idea of religious toleration, I believe. That's how he gets there. Martha Nussbaum, another very, very prominent contemporary American philosopher who's fortunately still with us, wrote about this, and she said something I think very important by way of criticism. The pursuit of mutual advantage and the success of one's own projects, that is mutual disinterest, is not less than a compassionate commitment to the well-being of all human beings. It's just different. It goes in quite a different direction. So I think what Martha Nussbaum is arguing in her critique of Rawls, that is in this recent volume, Frontiers of Justice, is by eliminating altruism, compassion, benevolence, etc., from his initial assumptions, Rawls may have made a basic fundamental mistake. He imagined he was constructing a foundation, and that on that foundation you could then build a house that included all these wonderful moral values. But if you build your foundation in certain ways, there's certain kinds of houses you cannot build on it. Okay? And Nussbaum is pointing out the possibility that by eliminating certain things from his foundation, he therefore didn't made it very hard, if not impossible, for these things to be later added on. And maybe that was a fundamental failure of Rawls's methodological approach. And maybe what we needed, if we're going to be dedicated Rawlsians in a better way, is to have a richer set of initial assumptions. The idea that we could dispense with them because they could be controversial, may be paying way too high a price in terms of what that house eventually looks like that we build on that foundation. Okay? So here's the question. Supposing we look elsewhere in Rawls's theory of justice to see whether he had an idea that he actually could have applied to religion and religious and philosophical diversity, to the diversity of comprehensive doctrines, which would have done him better in terms of a view that avoided Nussbaum's criticism, that led to a better view than mere religious toleration. And I think he had the idea, but he didn't apply it in this particular area. The idea he had was differences among people in society, in a society like ours, in skills and talents that lead to different contributions to economic production are viewed in his schema as a common natural resource, somewhat akin to mineral wealth, clean environment, and so forth. What the heck does that mean? What Rawls is saying here is that I hope that they haven't yet closed all the auto factories in Michigan. So I'm hoping somewhere there's still an auto plant going in Michigan. 2 minutes? Really? Thought we had 10 by my watch. But... Okay, well let me do the best I can. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so so there's this guy who likes working on the auto assembly line. He's good at it. And he makes good quality cars on that assembly line. And that's his job, and he likes doing it, and he's happy with his job. I would be hopeless if you put me in that job. I would not do a good job at all. That other guy might not do so well if you put him in a classroom with some medical students. Okay? So if everybody was like me, we'd have no cars. If everybody was like him, we'd have no doctors. So it's really good for society that there's this diversity of talents and skills. And the existence of this diversity is a kind of common resource, just like a clean environment is. We can not each of us own it ourselves. It's something that all of us in society must take advantage of as a whole society without private ownership of it. Okay, so this, he says, establishes a principle of reciprocity as a key component of justice. So I think, why don't we think about diversity among comprehensive doctrines the very same way we think about diversity of talents and skills? Why don't we think about the comprehensive doctrine variance, the diversity among comprehensive doctrines, as the same kind of social enrichment, the same kind of natural resource, that all of us in society are richer because this diversity exists? Why don't we view the diversity among religious views, specifically, not as merely something to be tolerated, but as something that enriches all of us and should be nurtured and cherished, not just tolerated? So I think this leads to a Rawlsian view that isn't what Rawls said, but is fully consistent with his basic philosophy. People should be encouraged to express views on public policy honestly and fully, which includes how their comprehensive doctrines ground and shape those views. So if you go into public square and Islam is part of the education, part of the tradition, part of the information that causes you to take a certain stance on a public policy debate, why not be transparent? Why not share with the public square? This is where my views come from. This is my grounding. On this basis, I offer these views. Now, there would be some cases where we'd go too far and we really would have disrespect for others, or where we'd end up being very anti-democratic. The burden of proof is on the objector to show that this is one of those circumstances. We can't simply say, oh, it might lead to that. It might be anti-democratic. It might be disrespectful. We have to say, no, no, no. This particular way of expressing your views in the public square is anti-democratic. We can prove it. Then we have to say, please don't do that here. But we don't start with the assumption that it's not welcome. It has to be proven to be not welcome because it actually does violate important democratic values. And then what is civic virtue? Is still a concept of civic virtue is important. What it teaches us is when we do exercise our rights and when we do express our views, including our comprehensive philosophical religious doctrines, in the public square, and we offer it to our friends and our neighbors who may not share those comprehensive doctrines, how do we do it? And I think, once again, mutual respect, but particularly I think it teaches us humility. How in a society like ours can I claim I am so darn sure that my comprehensive doctrine is better than all of yours? Or do I have to be humble and say, I believe in this very devoutly, but I certainly understand that there are others among my neighbors who do not have these same beliefs? And what kind of humility then becomes the person who's going into the public square to offer this discussion? So concluding, I think by clearing up some of these misunderstandings, bioethics can better incorporate wisdom for religious experience and practices into our field. We better understand what religion is and how we can study it. We better understand the role of religious views in public discourse, and we welcome a wider and deeper presence of religion in public life, including in discussions of healthcare. And then I would say, using the lessons we're going to learn from this very rich conference, we can decide how Islamic lessons and traditions can best be incorporated and learned from by people who are of Islamic faith and people who have other comprehensive doctrines, who can be educated and fully informed by sharing ideas with those from the Islamic tradition. Thank you very much for your kind attention.